guys, welcome to the channel. Welcome to a music video. This time I'm going through 10 of my favourite debut albums. Now, these are not only the 10 I like, there's hundreds of left, but I just sat down and thought, what are 10 of my favourite debut albums? There are ones that are also my favourites that I kind of haven't put in, just because these were the first ones that came to my mind. I mean, there's some incredible albums. No Rest for the Wicked by New Model Army, for one, I absolutely adore. In fact, that isn't their debut. Vengeance is their debut. So forgive me for that. But yeah, Vengeance by New Model Army is a fantastic album. You know, and there's loads of albums that I bought through my life and my years that I absolutely adore. So what is a debut album? A debut album is the band's first album, you know, that they release. So to them, it's a big milestone. It's their first album. Now, a lot of bands appreciate and love their first albums. A lot of bands go on to regret their first albums, thinking, no, you know, that's not the album we wanted to make. But it is a part of that band's history, and for us, the listener, they're really important, because a lot of these things are stuff that you get into and you think, yeah, I love that. I can't wait for that band to release something else. Now, all these albums here are debut albums I bought before the sort of bands made any more albums. There's only one in here that I bought. It wasn't the first album of that band I bought, but all the rest are the first ones I bought of that band. So this is why I picked this 10. Like I said, Vengeance, New Model Army, that wasn't the first album I bought by New Model Army. That was that I bought No Rest before that. That's why I was looking at that as their debut, but it's my debut buy, if you will, of them. But all these are the first album that I bought, and it happened to be their first album, except one, which a bit like New Model Army, I wanted to put in here because it's such a great album, and it is the debut album of Tubeway Army, which obviously Tubeway Army is Gary Numan's band before he went solo. He released 2 albums under Tubeway Army and Replicas, and then he went on to his solo career. We do have other albums of Tubeway Army. We have like one called The Plan, which is like a mixture of old release stuff and singles and things like that. But it's a compilation. It's not that. But this was his debut album, released on the Beggars Banquet label. Yeah, absolutely incredible album. Like I said, this wasn't the first Gary Numan album I bought. The first one I bought was Pleasure Principle. Then I bought Replicas. Then I bought The Plan. Then I bought this. It's about 4 down the line for me. But it's such a good debut album. It's nothing like his albums like Replicas and Pleasure Principle. This is more of a punky sort of feel to it. It's a heavier rock feel to it, not so much on the synthesizer. There are synthesizers in it, but not as prolific, if you will, in the beginning of the album. It's that's more in the back foot. So when they first started, they were more of a punk outfit, or post-punk outfit, if you will, and they were incredible, really, really cool. So that is a great debut album, I think, by Gary Numan and Tubeway Army, and it's just simply called Tubeway Army. Back when I was young, Two Tone was prolific in the sort of like 1979, 1980, that sort of thing, and I was already in love with post-punk at this stage. Like I said in other videos, I didn't really get into the punk scene till later in my life. I liked post-punk. I just found that more creative and more diverse and different to punk itself. When I did eventually get into punk, I got into the bands like Crass, Subhumans, Exploited, that sort of thing. I didn't really get into the Sex Pistols or the Clash or anything like that, but I appreciate them now. But back in the day, it wasn't my thing. I was listening to, like I said, Dr. Feelgood, Ian Dury and the Blockheads, all these wonderful bands at the time. And then Ska came along, and in that was Madness. And I remember going down to FL Moores after school on a Monday and buying One Step Beyond on its release date, just because it was like I'd had the single One Step Beyond, and I think the Prince had been out before this, but that was on the Two Tone label. If I remember right, this was released on, it's on a different company now, but I'm sure it was on Stiff Records. I think they'd already transferred by then to Stiff Records. And that, I remember right, that was the back cover, if you remember right, and that was the front cover. Yeah, I absolutely loved this album. It was really cool. When I first got it home, I enjoyed it because I knew some of the songs on there: My Girl, One Step Beyond, The Prince, Night Boat to Cairo, and all this sort of thing. But some of the other tracks took a little while to get used to, because I thought it was all going to be because I think I'd already had the Specials album before this, and that was all kind of sound pretty similar, and I liked that. And this didn't. It had a bit more variety to it. But I thought, God, this sounds like Ian Dury and the Blockheads. You know, when I first listened to it, I thought, this sounds like the Blockheads. And because I was so young, I didn't suss out, hang on a minute, they're both on the same label. And Madness were huge fans of Ian Dury. Because Ian Dury even ended up appearing on one of their albums, if I remember right. Yeah, absolutely fantastic, amazing album. It was just of its time, and I was so young, and I just got so into Madness. And then it took me a while to get hold of their second album. It's Absolute, was it? Or Absolutely. I wanted it, I just didn't have the money, but my parents ended up buying it for me on my birthday. I think I've talked about that before, so I was so chuffed to get Absolutely. But yeah, I bought this one on my own. I saved up for it, and I knew it was coming out because we were talking about it, and we've seen them on TV. You know, they were talking about their album coming out, so I managed to get money together, and I think it was about £3.99, something crazy like that. Now, if it come out on vinyl, it'd be like 30 quid, but back then it was about £3.99. And I've always had it in my collection, you know, from LP. I had it on cassette, I had it on standard CD, and now we got it on a double sort of a deluxe edition CD. When Madness released all their remasters, I managed to pick this up then. So really cool. Great debut album from the lads. Like I said, it does contain the hit singles One Step Beyond, My Girl, Night Boat to Cairo, The Prince, which is their debut single. Really cool album. Really fantastic. So it brings back a lot of memories when I listen to that. But like I said before, ska, I was really into post-punk, and of course, I think I've talked about this maybe in a Joy Division video, but this is another incredible debut album, Disorder by Joy Division. Now, I bought this album on vinyl because of the cover. Like I said, I'd never really heard of them. They were in the punk section, because in my FL Moores and Steams, I used to go to the punk section because they wouldn't just put punk in there. They would put post-punk in there. Gang of Four, Peru Ubu, Joy Division was in there. And I really liked the cover. And I thought, how's that a punk album? You know, because most punk albums were distinctive. And I'd never heard them. And I'd seen it in there. And week in, week out, when I used to go down there, I used to ponder about getting this album. This must have been about late 79, early 80. I was always thinking about, should I buy that? Because I'm always intrigued by the cover. And one week it was in there, and they had a sale sticker on it, like an offer. And it was down from £3.99 to £2.79. So I jumped on it, and I bought it, and I went home and I listened to it. And I thought, this is just like nothing I've ever heard before. It's amazing. It was really cool. I just loved Ian's very depressing vocal deliberation, if you will. It was so depressing, it was so different, you know. I was thinking, wow, how how dare you put that sort of sound on vinyl? You know, to have the courage to do that sort of. I'd never heard anything so depressing, you know, vocally wise before then, because everything I had in had a sort of distinctive or upbeat, you know, from David Bowie to even Lee from Dr. Feelgood, all had an upbeat, but he was just sounded. Oh, he just sounded like that throughout the whole thing. So sorry, I've got a chest infection at the moment. I'm sure I have. If it persists, I will go to the doctor with it. But I've had this cough for a few days now. But yeah, I just heard nothing of it. And the music was almost electronic, but it wasn't. Like I said, they had bass, guitar, drum, but it's the way it was played, especially the drums. Stephen Morris drumming, it sounded like a drum machine, but it wasn't. It was him, and it was amazing, absolutely incredible album, and I fell in love with it. Now this does have probably the most famous track on it. I think is Disorder. I'm not sure of transmissions on this one. I can't remember. My memory is shot. No, She Lost Control, that's it, and Disorder. They were the two sort of real standout tracks on there. Yeah, really cool debut album, Joy Division, Unknown Pleasures. So, obviously, my most of my record buying was in the 80s, because that's when I started to get money, you know, to myself. So most of these are from 80s when I had a little job. But there is a couple of 70s albums on here. Now, I didn't discover this artist until probably the late 80s, early 90s, when I worked at Al Price, and I used to play some of his albums, and I fell in love with it, and I bought his debut album, not on release. Now, I didn't buy all these on release day. These were the first albums that I bought that just happened to be their debut albums, and they were fantastic. So this is a 1970s album called 5 Leaves Left by Nick Drake. Really absolutely amazing album. Really cool. British folk album. I can only class it as. It's pretty much him on his own with some orchestration on some sort of tracks, but it's him with his acoustic guitar writing beautiful sort of very English sort of style of writing and music and vocal delivery. It's incredible. It's incredibly soft and gentle music. It was a real go-to chill out album. Like I said, I used to work in Al Price, one of my first jobs, and I used to put on a compilation album called Way to Blue, which was like a mixture of his album. I thought, wow, he's got distinctive. I used to play it on tape around the processing area, and I thought, oh, he's really cool. But I never bought that. I bought his debut album first, 5 Leaves Left, because I really liked the distinctive cover, which you can't really see on here, but if I lift it out, it was a very distinctive sort of cover, and I thought, wow, he looks just so cool. You know, it's a great cover, and I like the writing font and everything, and the back of the album looked like that. It's really cool. And I was just discovering sort of like new artists around it, because obviously I was working in the music shop and I had the chance to do that, and I discovered Nick Drake, and I just thought, wow, this is really cool. So I'm putting it down because it's too heavy to keep holding up. Yeah, it's a great album, and when I bought it and I listened to it, it was on my. I bought it on vinyl when I first got it, and it was on my turntable for months. It used to be my go home from work, have something to eat, lay on the bed, chill out, listen to that album. It became that sort of album to me, and I just thought, wow, this is incredible, absolutely amazing. It's an incredible debut album. Highly recommend it. Nick Drake's 5 Leaves Left. Probably the most popular track on there will be The Riverman, which I think was quite a hit for him later in his post his passing. Yeah, it became quite a big hit. But yeah, great debut album. But also from the 70s was a female artist that there wasn't many female artists that I liked when I started to get into music. I don't know why. I suppose I just didn't listen to them. I mean, I did have a big love for Susie Sue from Susie and the Banshees, but I just didn't really listen to many female singers until I started to listen to Dead Can Dance, which I fell in love with, and they had Lisa Gerrard singing with them, who she's incredible. But I remembered back when I was thinking, when I was quite looking through my collection. This was back in the 80s. I was looking for my collection. Apart from Susie and the Banshees and Dead Can Dance, I don't have any female singers. And I just sat there. Well, tell a lie. I did. I had a few Toyah albums because I love Toyah Willcox, and I still do to this day. I will do a Toyah video one day because I absolutely adore her. She's probably one of my favourite female vocalists. I think Toyah was my first female vocalist. She was my first pin-up girl, and I bought her albums, and I absolutely adore them. So I will do a video on her, but she's not in this because her debut to me is not. It was good, but it's not like a favourite of mine. These are all favourite debut albums. That's why I'm doing it on their first albums. So these artists' first albums, not the first albums of theirs I brought. But I think these are iconic debut albums. And her first album was really good, but it's not. I think it's Sheep Farming in Barnet, but it wasn't one of my favourites. But then I thought, I remember from the 70s seeing that really crazy singer, Kate Bush, and I just thought she was so different because I heard Wuthering Heights first back in the day because it was everywhere, wasn't it? And I just thought, yeah, maybe I will dig into her album. So I bought her debut album, The Kick Inside. And man, what an album. It's just blinding. It's just really, really cool. Like I said, I wasn't really necessarily into her back. First of all, say at the time I was listening to Dr. Feelgood, Slade, all this sort of pub rock. And I remember seeing her about, but when I was contemplating, I need some more female vocalists in my collection. Kate Bush jumped to mind. I thought, what about Kate Bush? So I went to, I bought this in Boots on vinyl for about £3, $2.99, if I remember right, back in the day. And I remember buying the album and I thought, wow, I actually quite like that cover. I thought it's quite unique. It's got a bit of a sort of Japanese oriental kind of feel to it. And I thought, I wonder if she's that way inclined, making sort of instruments like that. Because I was into Japan and I like that sort of sound. And I do remember Wuthering Heights, and there was nothing like that. And I heard other songs from her by then, of course, like Wow and things like that. But to start off, I thought, I'm going to go with a debut album. And what a killer of an album. Absolutely amazing. Now, this does contain Wuthering Heights on there. And The Man with a Child in His Eyes, which was another sort of big popular single. And I got into Kate Bush. And what I discovered and what I loved about Kate Bush was she recorded these albums pretty much herself, a lot of the stuff on it. She had her own studio in a like a shed in her house. She had like her own studio built, and she recorded a lot of instruments and music herself, and that drew me to her. And then I started to really appreciate Kate Bush. But this was the first album I bought by her, and it was her debut album. Not every band, like when I start to get into a band, I don't necessarily go for the debut album. Sometimes I go for their latest, and I enjoy it, and then it makes me want to look backwards. Like I said, with Gary Newman for one. Well, David Bowie, I mean, I bought Hunky Dory. That's not his first album, but and then I look backwards, and then but sometimes I start at the beginning, and I started with her debut album, and I thought this was an incredible album, and it still stands the test of time today. Now, this is a remastered edition on her Fish People label, which is her own sort of label, and it's really, really cool. Now, they did release a remastered one before this, which had extra tracks on it. This one doesn't. And a lot of people moaned about this when it came out, saying, well, why are you taking off the extra tracks? But I believe when Kate was interviewed about these remasters that she was doing, that she wanted them to be as they were when they were released. So she took off the extra tracks and released them as that. And I think that's a great idea. And so I really got into that, and I bought the standard album because that was how you meant to hear it. And that's how she released it. So I thought, yeah, absolutely, why not? So another fantastic debut album is The Kick Inside by Kate Bush. Highly recommend it. So the 80s, like I said, this is when I mostly got most of my albums, and I really heavily got into music. And I got into, you know, because of post-punk, I went down the alternative scene, most of it. And some of the synth pop, I didn't get into heavily into all the synth pop stuff like a lot of people did, you know. I appreciate that even more now, the synth pop, than I did then, you know. But I did like a few bands. Obviously, you know, I'm a huge Japan David Sylvian fan, so I got into them. I got into Soft Cell, The Human League, Gary Newman, and The Hurting by Tears for Fears. What another amazing album this is. What an incredible debut album. It was so dark. It almost verged on the edge of goth sort of music. When you listen to this, some of the songs almost sound like goth tracks. But yeah, they'd come out of nowhere really, with their sort of like hit singles, Suffer the Children and Mad World and Pale Shelter, which are all on here, and they were just phenomenal. And when I bought the album, I could not take it off my desk. I just played it and played it. I bought it twice because I scratched it and wore it out because I used to play it all the time. Yeah, and I just fell in love with this album. It was absolutely amazing. It was like none of the other bands. It didn't sound like Gary Newman. It didn't sound like Soft Cell. It didn't sound like Human League. It didn't sound like Japan. But it did have a bit of an art rock feel to it, because it was different. It did have a bit more of an arty sort of feel to it, which I really appreciated. I just thought, oh, it was just so cool. And one of my friends at the time, Eric, was so into this band. I think they became his favourite band, and I really appreciate them. But because I was so heavily into Japan, I just thought, nah, they're not as good as Japan. You know, they'll always be number one for me. You know, and that's what I thought at the time. But yeah, I really love this album. It was a fantastic debut album. They went on to make another album after it called Songs from the Big Chair, which was amazing. And then they disappeared. They disappeared for about 6-7 years until they released their third album, Seed of Love, which was amazing too, at the end of the 80s. And then we had a concession of albums afterwards. Even Kurt Smith left for a little while. You know, Roland still carried on the band, and they released back albums like Elemental and things like that. I just had it on my table, so I thought I'd share that. So, and then he rejoined the band, and they released more albums since. But yeah, this was a debut album, and was it a debut album? It's got to be one of the greatest debut albums of all time, surely. I can't do that, the best debut albums of all time, because it's too much of a minefield, and I'll get people saying, what about this, what about that? So I'm just going to go with 10 of my favourites. So that's what we're going through today, and we've only got 1, 2, 3, about 3 more to get through. 4 more, sorry, to get through. But yeah, absolutely amazing album, absolutely fantastic. And it was just, it sort of brought together a different sound, a different mixture of genres. Like I said, you had a bit of synth pop going on, you had a bit of new wave going on, a bit of post-punk, a bit of art rock, all formulated in one brilliant album. Absolutely amazing, you know. And I loved all that stuff, especially because I come from post-punk, which is what I loved, you know, when I was in the sort of like 77, 78, 70, it was post-punk was my thing, which I really adored, which this debut came from. Dirk Wears White Socks from Adam and the Ants. Is there a finer debut album? I don't know. When I've spoken about this before, I've said I think this could possibly be the finest debut album ever, and I still hold that in my head now. It was so unique. It just sounded different to everything I ever heard. It was punk and it wasn't. It was post-punk and it wasn't. It was art rock and it wasn't. It was like all three, but wasn't. It was just like nothing I'd heard before. And I just loved it. So me and my friend John, we went down and bought this because Adamant had released Amp Music, the single, and we both bought the 7-inch single of that. But we didn't have any of his albums or anything. So we went down to FL Moores on our bikes after school, and we both bought the same album. We bought that one, Dirk Wears White Socks. I'm not sure if Kings of the Wild Frontier was out at this time. I'm not sure, but we bought this one because of the price. It was £2.50. You know, it was £2.49 when I bought this album, brand new, and he bought the same. And we took it home, and I thought, this sounds nothing like Amp Music. In fact, I prefer this. It had more of what I was accustomed to, you know, Ian Dury and that sort of thing. It was a bit more different to anything I'd heard before. And I thought, yeah, this is really, really cool. And I really liked, well, I loved Car Trouble, which is obviously the biggest sort of hit off this album, was Car Trouble, which was a single. I think it was the only single that was on this album. All the other tracks like Kick and Xerox and that weren't on the album, but Car Trouble was, and it was a different version. It was two parts of the song put together, and I absolutely loved it. I just thought, this is just so cool. And I spoke to my mate about it at school the next day. He goes, yeah, it's all right. He wasn't that keen on it because I think he liked the Amp Music thing, but his dad went and bought him Kings of the Wild Frontier. Because I think he knew he was a bit disappointed with it. So I went round his house and we listened to Kings of the Wild Frontiers, and we just thought, oh, this is the Adam the Ants that we know. And he loved that, and I thought it was incredible. I didn't buy it until another month or two down the line, just because I'd already purchased this one. And back at that time, although records were a lot cheaper than they are now, it was still a lot of money for us back then, because we're young, you know, we're 11, 12, that sort of age, 13. We didn't have money to buy records all the time. So it had to be a major purchase for us. And I want to enjoy it. When I used to buy albums, I thought, I want to enjoy it, I want to indulge, I want to get to know the album. So I used to study the inside sleeves and stuff like that, if they had lyrics on them and things like that. So I used to do all that kind of thing and study the pictures and get to know the album. And I fell in love with Dirk Wears White Socks, and it became one of my favourite albums of all time. Amazing album. Highly recommend it. Dirk Wears White Socks, Adam and the Ants. So we've got 3 more to go. This one is an album by a band that in the sort of mid sort of 80s, I discovered a band called The Alarm, which I became good friends with and over the years become a part of. And I loved The Alarm. Now, I haven't got The Alarm in here. I was going to put out their debut album, but it's only a mini album, so I thought I won't do that. I'm going to go for a band that was similar to them at the time, and it's a Scottish band, and I thought it'd be good to get a non-English band, so I went with a Scottish band, and I've got Big Country and their debut album, The Crossing. Another fantastic album. Stuart Adamson's voice was just like, again, when I heard them, I thought, these are so unique, like them. In fact, although musically they're different, there are kind of similarities, because in a sense, Tears for Fears stood out from that synth pop new wave thing as being different. Big Country stood out from that, I don't know what to class that music. It was the time when the music, I suppose early indie pop, if you will. We had bands like Big Country, The Alarm, maybe Prefab Sprout, those sort of bands like that, Aztec Camera. They weren't a part of the synth pop or the new wave, but they were kind of attached lightly. A lot of it down to imagery, and because these were early sort of alternative music. They weren't goth bands. They weren't new wave. They weren't synth pop. They weren't post punk. They were kind of like alternative indie music, indie sort of music, before indie pop became a thing. And they had a very Celtic feel, a bit like The Alarm. The Alarm had a bit of a Celtic feel. The Alarm, I thought, were a bit like an acoustic version of The Clash. And these were a little bit more like that, but with a Celtic feel to it. You know, they just sounded like they're from Scotland, you know. And I just thought, wow, really cool. And then I bought this, and if I remember right, when I bought this, it had a blue cover, not a green. But yeah, I bought it on vinyl. It does have the singles Fields of Fire, Change, and In a Big Country, all on this album. Yeah, and it was a classic album. Really cool. Other bands that maybe U2, like the early U2, that sort of sound, Echo and the Bunnymen, you know, all those sort of bands like that, all kind of came out of the sort of, like I said, alternative, the start of the alternative sound, if you will. Not the gothic alternative, but the other alternative, like the British post-punk alternative, if you will, I suppose. Yeah, I'd class it as alternative post-punk. And Big Country were amongst them. And they were really cool with their check shirts and stuff like that. Stuart Adamson had such a presence and great vocal. And he'd come from another band that I already liked, the Skids. I loved the Skids because I love post-punk, and I had pretty much 3 or 4 of their albums. I'd already bought the Skids before them. But he'd left and started his own band called Big Country. Unfortunately, Stuart's no longer with us. But yeah, what an amazing debut album. Really, really cool. One of my best friends, who's been best friend now in my life pretty much since I was about sort of 12, 13, 14, is my friend Rob. And when I met Rob, he used to go down Bowes Lion House where I used to go. We used to go to the alternative discos, and they used to have bands playing there at the weekends. And I met Rob there. But Rob was different to everyone else. He would turn up with his, he had sort of ginger curly hair. He used to wear like a combat green jacket, and he was so different to everyone else. We were all dressed like goths with spiky hair and wearing black, and he was different, but he liked different music to us. He was into prog rock, you know, and sort of 70s rock. He liked Deep Purple, he liked Black Sabbath, and he liked Marillion, and he got me into Marillion. And I started with them with their debut album, Script of the Jester's Tear. Now, I had heard of Marillion because of the single Garden Party, which is on this album. He got me into this album because we used to talk a lot, and he said, you know, you might quite like Marillion because they are not your average prog. They do have sort of a bit of a edgier, heavier feel to them, but they're still very, very British, because I was really into British music, and I still am. I was into, like I said, post-punk and pub rock, which is really a British sort of style of music. And I was so into that. And he said, you might appreciate them. So I said, well, what should I start with? Because I did like Garden Party. And he said, well, they'd had a few albums out by then. He said, start with either Misplaced Childhood or Script of the Jester's Tear, which is their debut. And when I saw the album cover, I thought that was mind-blowing. I thought, wow, that looks like Killing Joke, you know, because I remember Killing Joke having like a jester on some of their stuff, and I thought, wow, are they going to be that sort of long? Because I quite like Killing Joke, but no, it wasn't. It was a prog, and it was only a 6-track album, but it was really, really good. So I bought this, and then I bought a live album called Real to Real, which I appreciated as well. I thought, I want to get that as well because it's got Garden Party on it, and I really enjoyed it on this album because he swore on that, and I was just thinking, oh, it didn't swear on the single version, and I fell in love with it, and I've had a love affair with Marillion since. There's 2 versions of Marillion. Obviously, the beginning years you had them with Fish, and Fish left the band to pursue his own career. and then they recruited Steve Hogarth as their vocalist, and I do prefer the Steve Hogarth Marillion over the early Marillion, because I think although this is good, it is of its time. It's aged well, but it's not the sort of thing you'd recommend anyone now. But it's the Marillion now is what I'd recommend people to listen to if they want to listen to Marillion, because they're phenomenal. But they were really, really cool, and this was a great debut album. Only 6 tracks, but it was a really cool debut album. Script of the Jester's Tear. So we got one more to go through, and this one, my favourite artists, right, are Gary Newman, David Bowie, David Sylvian, and Japan. Japan's debut album I didn't really get into till later on in life, so I'm not going to put that down as one of my favourite debut albums. But David Sylvian's debut album, 100%. Brilliant Trees by David Sylvian. If this isn't the greatest debut album of all time, this well could possibly be. It's an amazing album. Japan split. Didn't see it coming, and I was a little bit heartbroken. A year or so later, David released his debut album, and I was so relieved. And I thought, I'm never going to hear him again. Yeah, he'd done a few singles. Like I said, he'd done some work with Rishi Sakamoto. He'd done the Bamboo House double single. He'd done the Forbidden Colour tracks, and we'd had a few things like that on along. Mick Karn had gone on to do Titles, his debut album, which was okay. It wasn't brilliant, but it was okay. But then we got David's debut album, which I thought was going to come because we had a single appear out of nowhere called Red Guitar, which I brought. I remember when I went on holiday with my family to Perranporth with my mum and my sister and family friends, Benita, who I went to concerts with, and they had a T-shirt making shop in this sort of like camping place we went to. They had made T-shirts, and they had David Sylvian one. I got them to make me a T-shirt of David Sylvian. It was a white T-shirt with the cover of Red Guitar on it, and I just thought it's the greatest thing I ever had. But yes, I thought we're going to get an album, and sure enough, when we got back from holiday, in my local record shop was Brilliant Trees. A bit different cover to this. It's the same picture, but it had a yellow border all the way around it, and it had David Sylvian, Brilliant Trees. I jumped on it. £3.99, and I jumped on it. And I just thought, wow. So I took it home, and I played it, and I played it, and I played it. And I've got to say, it's one of the most atmospheric albums I've ever heard in my entire life. It's just full of atmosphere. It's even down there. It says David Sylvian, vocals, guitar, synthesizers, atmospherics. It was even down there as an instrument, because he'd recorded and sampled sounds from different things. Almost like vintage sort of radios and stuff like that, and it was just like nothing I ever heard before. And it also had a really strong jazz feel to it and a strong world music feel to it, and it was so withdrawn yet so like Japan in so many ways. Some of the melodies and the keyboard were so Richard Barberi sort of sounding, and I just thought, wow, this is the greatest thing in the world. And I just fell in love with the whole album. Obviously, the album does contain musicians on here. Steve Jansen's on it. I think Sakamoto's on it. And Richard Barberi's on it. So that's why I got this sort of sound of Japan on there and stuff. And like I said, Sakamoto plays on it. Steve Jansen, which is his brother, he plays on it. It's fantastic. Amazing, amazing album. And this, to me, is the ultimate debut album. It's just beautiful. It's beautiful. It's just great. It opens up with Pulling Punches, which is quite an upbeat song for David. And it had almost like a Peter Gabriel sound feel to it. Like a world music feel, and then it went into a jazz sort of track with Ink in the Well, which also became a single, and then it had that really atmospheric song Nostalgia, which suits the song. And then they went into the single Red Guitar. And in side 2, there was 3 tracks: Weathered War, Backwaters, and Brilliant Trees. And it almost played like a world music album with that sort of Japan. Now, I'd already fallen in love with that sort of thing because of the Japan tin drum, and the stuff he'd done with Sakamoto had world music and sort of like oriental feel to the sound of it. This was more otherworldly. I could hear things like, when I listened to it, I could hear almost tribal drumming and things like that. And it's just like, wow, you could see someone in a Tibetan hill playing these sort of instruments, and it just sounded like that. And it was so artistically put together, and a wonderful, beautiful album. Highly recommend if you don't have that album. It could possibly be, apart from that, my favourite debut album. Massive shout out to my lad. See you soon, guys.